Hi, hope you've been having a good summer. It's me, Bennett, in the flesh. Hello. I never really know what to put in these intro bits, so I'm just doing out the vlog style thing where I just stare at the camera and talk for a while, and we'll see how it goes. So in general, the past few months, my life outside of making painting videos has been pretty busy. So that part of the hobby's kind of fallen by the wayside for me. But I have still been working on a lot of other hobby projects, both things I've recorded footage for and things I've done just totally off camera. So I have a lot of random projects in progress right now, but the first one up that I'm making another video for is this commission painted Blood Bowl team that I worked on. I know, who would have guessed? Another Blood Bowl team. My god. This time it was some witch hunters, which I can't actually show in person right now since I shipped them out weeks ago, but here are some edited shots of them. Something like this, maybe? Here? Anyway, kind of embarrassingly, this project was in progress for like half a year or so before I finally got them finished and shipped out. But now it's done, and I'll show my progress and share some thoughts on the minis, my color choices, and things like that. So anyway, enough of me rambling at you, and on to the actual video. These minis are made by Punga Miniatures and are made using cast resin. I'm not really sure what the Punga Miniatures resin prep process is like, so just to be safe, I washed them all in a soapy water bath with an old toothbrush, rinsed them off thoroughly, and then let them dry. At first, I thought these minis would be a breeze to assemble. There's not too many parts, and on the first couple of models I looked at, there were almost no mold lines to be seen, which was kind of amazing to me. But they soon proved me wrong. There are still mold lines hidden here and there, but overall, still not bad. Where it does get bad, though, are the connection points. Most of them really do not want to stay attached when they're being glued together. Lots of the keys, where like the arms and torsos and things connect together, also have injection points on them that all need to be cleaned up. I had so much trouble with just gluing together all of the parts that I ended up putting little bits of green stuff between the super glue on almost every single join to get it to hold. Sometimes doing this, the green stuff takes up space, so I also had to trim down the connection points a bit so that there was enough room for the green stuff to sit in the gap. I'm not trying to be too critical of the minis or anything. I really enjoy the character of the sculpts, but honestly the assembly itself was pretty rough. I was given more or less total creative freedom with this project, and I decided to make sort of a ruined city look, with a sort of strong nighttime lighting effect being a prominent part of the look. To that end, I'm including a lot of flames, torches, and candles and such on the bases. The general idea is that one half of the mini will be lit with a strong, sort of yellowish-orange color, and the other side will be a very cool dark blue color. As a starting point on the bases, I used some of these 3D printed cobblestone base toppers. Some of them I just glued on whole, but some of them I also chopped up before I glued them on. Then I just used a random variety of texture paste, Mod Podge, coarse and fine sand, coffee stir sticks, jewelry chain, all sorts of random bits and pieces that I had around to give the impression of a ruined city on the bases. And as I mentioned, I want most, if not all, of these minis to have a light source on their base. It could be a lantern, it could be a torch, whatever, just some kind of light source. So I find ways that I think are decently creative and varied to add that to the basing. Specifically, the candles that I glued to the raised cobblestone toppers didn't look particularly convincing, and I didn't really like how there was a big gap that was pretty noticeable between them and the floor. So I used some green stuff to fill in that space with sort of a layer between the cobblestones and the candles to give the impression of the candles puddling a bunch of wax. Then to attach all the minis to the bases, I used super glue, but again reinforced it with little bits of green stuff under the feet. The bad adhesion of the resin surfaces together, combined with the rounded cobblestone texture, means that the joins between the feet and the bases were not very solid, and without the putty there to provide a better surface, the minis would have pretty easily fallen off before the glue dried. So yeah, that part was a little rough, but onto the painting now. For speed, and because my airbrush was being troublesome, I rattle can primed all the minis black. I'm still planning on painting these minis in the Darkest Dungeon inspired, sort of dark, Baroque comic style I've used in the past, but I thought I'd try painting the minis with a slight twist. I airbrushed a dark blue to dark red gradient on the minis, with red on the half of the mini facing the light source on the base, and the blue half on the shadowed side. The idea was that instead of just having pure black shadows, they would have this interesting warm, cold variation to create some contrast in the shadows. But just totally fast forwarding through painting a test mini, here's what I got to, and I wasn't really sold on how the effect looked. Without the black shadows, it felt like it didn't have the visual punch I wanted, and the shadows looked too close in color to the rest of the surfaces. So, back to the drawing board. The unfortunate thing here is that I spent a good chunk of time airbrushing all the minis with this blue to red gradient first, so now I also had to undo all of that. But, oh well, that's, I guess, a good lesson for doing one test model first before doing something to all your minis. For my second stab at painting the models, I switched to a pure black base coat. Then it doesn't really matter what order these next layering steps are done in, but I started with the blue cloth just because I'll be painting a lot of the cloth blue. For this I start with a dark, desaturated blue mix, and then push the highlights up through a light gray blue. I also treated this first coat of blue as sort of a layer, and by that I mean that I left a lot of black in the recesses, only painting the raised edges or larger surfaces. But I tried to leave a decent amount of the surface just pure black. I'll be leaving black shadows like this with every part of the mini that I'm painting, but with the blue specifically, I'm also trying to build up the highlights in sort of an overbrushed, scratchy way, to just imply some roughly textured cloth of some kind. I think this helps to add a lot more visual interest to the minis as well. Specifically, sometimes I do this just by drawing highlights in as a bunch of lines, but sometimes I also opt for an old, worn-out synthetic brush that has a bad tip, and then with the right paint consistency and with not too much paint on the brush, when I drag it along the surface it'll create some nice thin lines, kind of where each small group of brush bristles hit the surface. Now this isn't something that always works, and it's a little tricky to get right, and also you can't really control the result as much, but it is a lot faster than using a brush with a sharp tip to manually make every single line one by one. Anyway, the rest of the surfaces are just more of the same, just a layer-like base coat that leaves a lot of black in the recesses, and then continuing on with some layered highlights. I also specifically want to call out that I make some of the cloth red as an accent color, but I avoid highlighting the red with orange or yellow colors, since I don't want this surface to clash too much with the object source lighting effect that I'll be doing later, which might kind of muddy everything and make it less readable, like what's glowing from fire and what's a red cloth surface. So that's why I'm highlighting this red into more of a pink color. I should also mention that I do push the highlights brighter closer to the light source on the base, or wherever I decided that the bright side of the mini will be if it doesn't actually have a light source on its base. This is sort of a preemptive value sketch so that when I tint everything later, the areas closer to the lighting effect will look naturally brighter. Then with all the colors on the actual mini, I also prepare the light source for the glowing effect. I do this by base coating that part that will be glowing with a couple thin coats of pure white, to get it nice and bright. Then I put some thinned yellow and orange paints over the white, keeping the orange color closer towards the darker tips of the flame. I got the rest of the base prepared for airbrushing, doing some simple highlights on all the stones, wood, ground, candles around the flames, and whatever. Really, it's nothing too complicated, so I'm not going to bother listing all of the exact steps and all the exact paints that I used. Then I took the darkest satin black paint that I have, and I used that to reinforce some of the black shadows, expanding them where I felt it was needed, and adding a bunch of random black scratches and lines on the surfaces. Now it's all ready for the airbrush tinting, and I completely forgot to record that part. But it's nothing too wild, just airbrushing a thinned down yellow speed paint around the glowing object, an orange ink or speed paint further away from it, and then a very thin, dark bluish speed paint color on the shadowed side of the mini. Hopefully these 360 spins give you a decent idea of how it ends up looking. Then I just did a little bit more off-camera cleanup work as well, mostly some extra white and yellow highlights around the light source, or brightening the center of the light source itself again. I also redefined some of the black lines and shadows that were affected a bit too much by the airbrushing, but luckily with how transparent those speed paints and inks were, this is pretty minimal. That's all of the actual team minis done, and now it's onto a bunch of these 3D printed braziers of fire that go along with them. I opted for a bit of a different approach on these braziers, so that's why I'm separating them out into a separate section here, because given how much flame effect is on these, and given that the flame effect is inside of this metal cage, I want to approach it differently to make it easier. So I actually started by priming these minis white, and then once that had dried and cured, I painted some thin khaki on the skulls around the base, then a medium metal color on the metal, going really fast, just like almost globbing it on even. Then, trying something kind of interesting and new to me, I mixed some of this Procryl Noosh medium with a bit of water, and a decent few drops of black paint, and I applied it all over the bone and metal surfaces, and then came back and wiped it off gently with a damp paper towel or with my brush. This worked pretty well, I think, to leave really strong black color in the recesses, but still get those pretty bright highlights. This did pull up a little bit of the khaki paint if I rubbed too hard, but I'm not too worried about that. I just tried not to be too rough, and I didn't want to bother varnishing first. To establish the actual flame colors, I take a crappy old flat brush and I roughly catch the raised surfaces this time, leaving the recesses and the area towards the bottom appear white. I shift to some orange paint and use that as more of a heavy dry brush, focusing this especially around the tips of the flame. Where it's necessary in the small gaps between the metal, I use a small brush to apply these reverse highlights of yellow and orange. I keep doing this again once or twice, working down all the way to a dark red color, which I think leaves me with a pretty impactful color gradient for the fire effect. With that done, I do a strong highlight of silver around the metals, focusing especially on the parts right next to the fire. Next is a couple of quickly overbrushed or dry brushed layers of khaki up to bright ivory around the skulls, and then a thin highlight of pure bright ivory. These highlights are focused more around the gaps between the metal, where the flame is sort of poking through and would be casting a lot stronger of a light. Then I go to some pure black, and I use that for blacklining and picking out some shadowed areas. And then I also do some edge highlighting on parts of the flame edges and tips, which, I think stylistically helps to tie it in a bit more with the sort of Darkest Dungeon comic painting style. And to make sure the flame is sort of tinted the same way as the rest of the minis on the team, I do the same airbrushing of the yellow speed paint and then that bright orange P3 blazing ink. And here's the team all painted up. There was also an extra gargoyle statue and a cursed fountain type thing that I painted to go along with them, but I completely forgot to take pictures or video of them, but they were basically just painted as stone with some glowing fire effects, nothing too complicated. This project was a long time in the works, and it was a bit more tricky than I expected it to be at first, but I am very pleased with the result. Hopefully this video provides some inspiration or help or entertainment for you, and as always, ask me any questions you have in the comments and I'll do my best to answer. Thank you for watching, and it's good to be back. Take care of yourself, I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video.